The annual general debate of the United Nations 193 member states is characterized by speeches and high-level meetings. And this year's assembly saw many first-time speakers, including Donald Trump. But African leaders refused to be overshadowed by the controversial U.S. president, with South Africa's Jacob Zuma, Egypt's Abdel El-Sisi, and Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe all tackling controversial issues themselves. Let's take a look at some of the highlights of this year's debate.
The current structure of the global economy continues to deepen the divide between the global north and global south. While a few enjoy the benefits of globalization, the majority of the peoples of the world still live in abject poverty and hunger.
Climate change is a present reality, and so are its effects and impacts. Climate change is global. We cannot remain silent when a major economic power in the world, or any other state for that matter, decides to abandon the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And that's the United States, the great United States, Mr. Trump's United States.
The African Union is fully committed to prioritizing prevention, mediation, promoting dialogue and finding peaceful political solutions, and also peace building. These are all less costly than peacekeeping operations whose effectiveness raises many questions.
I tell the Palestinian people it's extremely important to unite behind the goal and to overcome differences and seize opportunities, and to be ready to accept coexistence with the others, the Israelis, in safety and security, and to achieve stability and security for all. And I say, and I direct my call to the Israeli people, we have an excellent experience in Egypt in peace with you for longer than 40 years. We can repeat this experience and this excellent step once again. The peace and the security of the Israeli citizen, together with the peace and security of the Palestinian citizen.
And now to offer further analysis into the 72nd UN General Assembly and Africa's representation there, I have expert guests standing by. In Lagos, Ola Bello, he's the Executive Director at Good Governance Africa. In Johannesburg, Michael Tudakasa, he's the CEO at Africa Business Group. And with me in Nairobi here in studio, Dr. Mustafa Ali, he's the co-founder of the Horn Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining in on the program. Dr. Mustafa, let me start off with you because you attended the UN General Assembly proceedings, or some of them at least. African leaders attended and gave their statements there. What's your take on their presentations?
Yeah, I think some of the African leaders that were at the General Assembly were excellent. They spoke to the issues that they needed to speak to, issues that are troubling the world today, and in particular the South. If you had Jacob Zuma, Robert Mugabe, including Buhari, they spoke to issues that are affecting the security of the world. In particular, Zuma talked about the fact that the United Nations should actually do more. And Museveni supported Donald Trump's call for a reformed United Nations, which is long overdue. The organization has been there since 1946, remained largely the same, has not reformed, and it seems that it is not responding to the challenges, particularly the challenges of security, as it should in the 21st century.
Right. Michael Tudakasa?
I think that issue that was just mentioned by my colleague about security was a very important one. I think that also during the week's activities, the effort by Donald Trump in particular to curry favor and show some knowledge with African leaders, although he misspoke about Namibia, the general shift was that there's business opportunity in Africa. And I think for the days after his comments, there was a lot of news coverage of that point.
Right. Ola Bello.
I mean, I have to underline, you know, what the United Nations General Assembly is actually about. I think it's often a great opportunity for leaders to come out and make good speeches at the UN General Assembly every September. I think much of the work that often needs to be done, and in Africa's case, there are legion of issues that I think are concerning the continent at this time. We must see it for what it is, an opportunity to get up on the podium and say nice things. But I suspect much of what Africa needs to push forward in terms of the agenda that most concern the continent, security, climate change, also ensuring that there is adequate funding for a lot of the UN peacekeeping missions. A lot of them here in Africa, much of those work need to take place outside the UN General Assembly chambers.
Right.
So in terms of platitudes and looking good in front of the camera, I think they've done well. Much of the work would need to now take place, you know, after the UN General Assembly week.
Right. Dr. Mustafa, a few issues that have been raised by the panel here, issues of security, issues of business and trade. Let's start off with that whole question of the global divide, because President Zuma did talk about the widening global divide between the global north and the south, and he talked about the system being unjust and ensuring that the global south remained in abject poverty. How unjust is it?
Essentially, there is a lot of injustice in the manner in which the trading is being done. For example, that the business people, the farmers from the global south are not able to access markets from the more developed north. And this is done by design. If you look at the WTO rules, if you look at the rules that are there, they are actually designed to keep some of these countries down. If you look at the way the International Monetary Fund is structured, the World Bank is structured, no African, nobody from the south can ever ascend to the helm of the World Bank. The World Bank has always got to be led by the United States of America and the IMF by a European. And this in itself tells you that there is no place for the Africans and people from the south at the table. And you know, if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. You will just be selected and you will be chosen whatever food that should be eaten. Now, the second point here is, and we in Africa especially have to take full responsibility for this,
right,
is that our leaders majority of our leaders seem to not understand what governance and statecraft is. They just want to amass wealth for themselves, and they don't really care about the countries that they are leading.
Right. Michael Tidakasa, you have mentioned that President Donald Trump did talk about doing business in Africa. And Africa's been talking about more trade, less aid. But of course, one of the issues that came up was exactly where globalization was heading. So how is Africa going to benefit, or the global south going to benefit, if multilateralism is waning?
Well, I think we're on a trajectory that didn't necessarily start this year, where Africa is going to have to play a greater role in its own economic development in terms of promoting and facilitating intra-African trade. I think that the trend towards less aid is still there. We always are looking for humanitarian support when we can have it. We have a tremendous drought in East Africa that speaks to a need for greater resilience. We have still tremendous need for investment in electrification. So the discussion around renewable energy support from the UN and global north countries continues. But the challenge remains that domestic resource mobilization is going to be key. And the African Union, under the leadership of the president of Rwanda, has started looking at how the continent and the member states of the AUC can raise capital to fund the initiatives that have to happen. I think that theme also was one that you could pull from the conversations during the meetings last week.
Right. Olabello, your view is that this has been more of a talk shop and work needs to start now. What work is that you would like to see?
Well, I think, you know, we must leverage the UN General Assembly for what it is, you know, on the specific question of inequality in the world that you talked about. It's always been clear what we need to do, a lot that needs to happen here on the continent in terms of growing regional economies. So all of those things are about creating the enabling domestic environment for African entrepreneurs and other actors to succeed. But when we go to the United Nations, we must necessarily talk about that aspect that relates to the outside world and what partners can do in support of Africa and in partnership with our continent. So I'm very pleased to see that a lot of the leaders attended the meeting convened by the United States President to talk about some of these issues. But we cannot run away from it. I think we are at a very interesting juncture here where I think the 1 or 2, 3 issues that are most paramount for Africa in terms of our, you know, joint interest with global partners have been thrown into a lot of doubt, given the pronouncement we've had from the United States President, from climate change, from whether AGOA would be renewed. We've had some reassuring noises on all of those things. I think it's all very much up in the air, but it's good that we're having this conversation so that both sides can better understand where the interests are.
Dr. Mustafa, though, a lot of the conversations on eradicating poverty there did talk about the inequitable nature of the situation. So exactly how does the Global South want a reform of the economic structures or the other structures to ensure that that divide is bridged?
Yeah, I think 2 things here. One is those that can be carried out within the framework of the United Nations, and this is where the Sustainable Development Goals come in, the SDGs that actually succeeded the Millennium Development Goals, that there are a range of 16 different goals and many actions and yardsticks. That is one area. Then the second bit is, you know, the more economic aspects of issues that are normally carried out in the frameworks of the World Trade Organizations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. Now, if these institutions are not going to be reformed to ensure that Africans are at the policy table, then I'm afraid to say that there will be nothing that will be there for the Africans, and we will continue to suffer. As long as the African farmer is not going to get the worth of his or her produce because of the subsidies that are there in the north, then it's still going to be poverty for that poor farmer. It's not going to happen until we have visionary leaders. And as Olabello is saying, we're still a long way to go in terms of even understanding the international economic regime.
Right. Olabello, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, if there is something I would like to inject into this conversation, what's been really surprising for me is the reluctance to actually call a spade on the part of the African leaders, putting squarely on the table some of those issues that are paramount for Africa that I talked about and which I think are being significantly threatened by the posture of the United States President. We can enumerate a number of those issues. On climate change, whether the United States is staying in or out, I think all of that is still up in the air.
Right.
Cutting back on the United Nations budget, I think we all agree this reform needs to take place, but the United States needs to continue to fund a huge chunk of this. If peacekeeping mission in Congo, Mali, and elsewhere would go ahead, I don't think African leaders have been forthright in arguing for the continuation of some of these. And I think you see this in a broad suite of areas. I would like to see a bit more forthrightness and direct pronouncement on the part of African leaders in a way that President Trump might not welcome. But I think this necessarily have to be part of the difficult conversations that we must have with partners like the United Nations and the other partners at the United Nations.
Olabello, we'll leave it there for the moment, but thank you for joining us on the program. And for now, we're going to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll have more insights into Africa's representation at the UN General Assembly. Stay with us.